Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time today. I know it's a very, very busy time of the year, and I appreciate you joining us today for this webinar. I'm really excited to connect today about Tier 1 instruction and the universal tier as we face the opportunities and challenges of this year in particular. Um, Having an equitable and highly effective universal tier is just as important, if not more important, than ever before. And so, really excited to engage in this conversation around the universal tier and meeting the needs of all students. It has absolutely been top of mind as we went through last spring and throughout this summer, and now obviously into this fall as we continue to learn and plan for student success. So today we're going to focus on exploring a little bit about the universal tier, what it is, and then really dig very deeply into identifying and supporting Tier 1, both academic and social emotional behavior needs. So we'll look at identifying those needs within your system and then spend more time looking at how to improve the universal tier and focus specifically on things that you can do this year in your district to improve the instruction and equity of instruction that's happening for all students right away. We'll also explore supporting increased student engagement within the universal tier. And as Lynn indicated, we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So first, let's start by exploring the universal tier. So as we think about the universal tier throughout the next hour, you'll hear me use the words Tier 1, you'll hear me use core instruction, and I'll use these terms fairly interchangeably. We all, though, have different experiences with and background knowledge with understanding what the universal tier encompasses within our settings. And so I'm interested just in the chat if you can enter what do you know of when you think about the universal tier or Tier 1 instruction? What are the things that you think about in terms of the components or the words that come to mind first? And so just in the chat, feel free to put your ideas, and we can read what others are saying. Universal design, yes, all students. UDL, Universal Design for Learning. I saw 80%, I think, flyby. Tiers, Tier 1 for everyone. Small groups, I read school climate, multiple modalities, evidence-based instruction. Ooh, available and accessible by all. Inclusion, RTI, good instruction. Yeah, so we hear things, prevention programs. Yeah, so we think of things when we're thinking about the universal tier. Thank you so much for sharing those ideas. And I like the last one that I see right now: beneficial to students with special needs and all students. Yeah, so the universal tier, when we're thinking about the universal tier, we're really thinking about the resources that are available to all students. And so those resources that we're providing in a school toward the success of supporting all students. So when we think about later in the slide, later in the presentation, we'll look at the obligatory MTSS pyramid. But when you think about the universal tier, we're really thinking about, in that whole pyramid, we're thinking about the resources that we have available to us in a school. And when we think about the instruction, the assessment, and the curriculum that we're using, the curricular materials that we're using, we're really using those things that we have available to all students that are really helping us focus on achievement toward grade level standards. And we really expect that our universal tier resources are going to meet the needs of most students. So when you think about that MTSS pyramid, or you think about the universal tier, really be thinking about resources first, as opposed to students, and those resources that we have available to all students. And so all students access things within the universal tier and the resources within that universal tier. So that could include the teachers, the time, the instructional strategies, curricular materials. And so all of those things that are available to all students are the universal tier. When we think about effective universal instruction, we're really thinking about universal instruction that meets the vast majority of learners' needs without additional intervention. So we think about that universal instruction or tier one instruction. It really needs to be effective for the vast majority of students in order for us to see large gains in student growth, and in order for, in most schools, for us to meet our achievement goals. And so when we think about an effective universal tier, things that I've learned since I was in college many moons ago, is that not one set of curricular materials, not one set of instructional strategies, not one set of schedules for a building will work universally. What we know is that the intensity of our universal tier or tier one instruction, as well as the skills focus for that work, will need to vary based upon the background knowledge and needs of our students. And the important goal, though, is that we need to make sure that our universal tier instruction is effective for the vast majority of students in our building, or we're going to have difficulty having a system that supports all learners. So if and that those are the things that I didn't learn in college. Instead, what we focused on is that when we have large percentages of students who aren't meeting our expectations, we were often told to focus on intervention. And we were focusing on intervention to close those gaps. And what we learned is that over time, focusing improvement efforts solely on intervention is really only effective when there are a reasonable number of students who need additional support. If we're in a building or a setting with large numbers of students who need additional instruction or intervention in order to be successful, we can't rely specifically on intervention and only on intervention to help close those gaps, because we'll end up with intervention that is no longer evidence-based. So we do really well-meaning things. If we have more students who need intervention, then intervention slots or time to provide. And so we'll do things like we'll break up an intervention period into 2 periods. And so instead of maybe a 40-minute intervention, we'll have 2 20-minute interventions to be able to provide that intervention to twice as many students. Or instead of a 5-day-a-week intervention, we'll offer a 3-day-a-week intervention and have some students receive that extra instruction on Monday and Wednesday, and some students receive it on Tuesday and Thursday. What that does is it makes that intervention no longer evidence-based. So if I choose an evidence-based intervention, chances are it was the research that was done in order to validate it was based on completing a lesson a day, typically 5 days a week. And so in those cases, if I'm no longer able to deliver that intervention because there's a large number of students who need it, if I'm no longer able to deliver that intervention in the way it was researched, then I'm a lot less likely to get the benefits that we expected. And so that's why we tend to see that if we focus solely on intervention to close gaps, in places where we have large numbers of students who need intervention, we don't tend to see the effectiveness that we hope, and we don't tend to meet our goals. That's why when we think about the universal tier, we really want to focus on getting effective universal instruction in place so that our interventions can be focused toward just a few students and can be more effective for those students. So at this point, some of you, if you go having this conversation in your building, you may have others who say, well, that's really nice, Sarah, but we have a lot of students in our building who receive free and reduced lunch and who came to school with really low in kindergartner, or we have a lot of students with IEPs. When I see that, then and we know those things about our students' background, about our students' needs, then those are all, to me, reasons that we need to be focusing more on the universal tier. And so as we think about, again, that MTSS pyramid, and we think about that pyramid as resources, not students, think about the resources that we have within our school, and being able then to focus those resources on improving the universal tier, as opposed to spending more resources toward identifying new interventions, toward intervention scheduling, and coming up with new ideas for those things. Let's focus some of that professional learning and time and attention toward improving the universal instruction that we provide to all students in order to see a greater growth overall within our building. So now that we have talked about why we might want to focus on the universal tier, let's explore really how to identify and support both academic and social emotional needs as we look at the universal tier. So, the only way that I recommend identifying tier one needs in academics and social emotional behavior is through universal screening. So, when we talk about universal screening, we're really meaning looking at data for all students multiple times a year. Can look different and at different grade levels. But really, what we're doing is preventatively identifying both individual needs for individual students, which obviously may or may not include tier one supports, and also identifying group needs, which is what we'll focus more on today as we think about universal tier in general. But it's really important that we think about universal screening as essential to ensuring that we have a system that's really focused on prevention and early intervention. If we have a system that waits for individual teachers or family members to refer students for additional support or to identify when there might be tier one needs. We've flipped to a fully reactive system, and we no longer have this preventative system in place where we can prevent small achievement gaps or small skill gaps from becoming larger achievement gaps that will take longer and will become more difficult to remediate. And so universal screening is really essential in this area in order to really identify strong tier one universal needs as well as to build a preventative system overall. So when we think about universal screening tools, we're really thinking about tools that are predictive of overall achievement. And so when you're thinking about selecting universal screening tools, identifying those that are predictive of overall achievement in reading or math, that can predict overall around social, emotional, and behavioral needs, that are really quick and efficient to administer. And so we want to choose tools that allow us to assess everyone within a school and grade level in a very quick and efficient manner, because we do not want to replace any instructional time with this universal screening effort. And so we absolutely want something that can be delivered in a quick and efficient manner, that are valid and reliable for predicting overall achievement. And it's a bonus if we can do these two things. So if in your school you can have the same assessment across grade levels, that works really well for a couple reasons. So one, you can use that then for teachers to talk to each other, and you can do vertical alignment work. And so in order for teachers to understand the data that are coming to them, it's easier if it's the same or a similar assessment and follows similar properties. The scores are the same, a similar type of score, and teachers can really easily understand those data that are coming to them. We'll find that we're more likely to use those data across grades. Also, it's really helpful to have similar assessments across grade levels, because then you can also start to do a cross grade level grouping as that makes sense. So for instance, I worked in an elementary school where we at the fall of kindergarten would have students who came in and would already meet when we did universal screening, would already meet the end of kindergarten standards, and we would assess those students with first grade assessments then, and we would be able to group those students into first grade for their reading or math classes. And in that case, we were able to do that because the teachers had an understanding of the screening tools. They were the same across grade levels in terms of being similar. So teachers had access and they knew how to administer them. And so we were able to do that because they were the same across grade levels. You also have the ability to identify, it's also a bonus if teachers can administer the assessments themselves. We find over and over again in districts that when teachers administer assessments, teachers own data and they are more likely to want to use the data. You're more likely to really be be impacted by those data and want to act on those data. And so data that we collect, we are more invested in, is basically what it is. So if you're in a school where you collect universal screening data, but right now there is maybe a school-wide assessment team that does that, and you find that you have less buy-in about the data, or people aren't as excited to talk about the data, even having teachers collect data for maybe 3 of their students, one who they identify as high achieving, one who's average achieving, and one who's lower achieving, and starting with that, and to really get to become familiar with the assessment and really gain more access to it can be super helpful. And you can see the obligatory pyramid here, MTSS pyramid, that shows across both academics and behavior, we should be collecting these universal screening data. And so once we have these data, the same data that you use to screen universally for student needs, so you're asking which students are at risk and may need additional intervention to be successful, you use those same data to ask questions about your tier 1 or universal instructional system. So we can say, is our universal tier sufficient? And then I always like to add, for the students in my building today, or the students in my district today. So, so asking, is that universal tier, are those resources and the way that we're supporting student needs universally sufficient for students in our building today? And those are the questions that we'll really be exploring as we go through this conversation. There's really 2 ways that we can be answering that question. First, we can look at the current skills or achievement of our students. And second, we can look at the growth that they make over time. And so let's explore both of those a little bit further. So first, we'll explore if students are meeting expectations. So this is an example of a report from FastBridge Assessments. In this case, it's what's called Fast Track Math. It's a series of 2 to 3 universal screening assessments that students take. In this case, at this grade level, it's 2 assessments that feels like one to students. It's computer-based, but then there are multiple scores that teachers get from that assessment. And so you can see here that at the top, in the body, teachers can see how each student performs, but at the top, they can see overall the percentage of their students who met the benchmark or the expectation for that assessment and on that score, looking at that skill. And then the report also provides them with a whole group recommendation, which we'll come back to in a minute. So overall here, we see that students, when we look at number or place value, more entry-level mathematics, more early math, skills, we have the majority of students are meeting benchmarks and expectations in that level. We do see, though, that a lower number of students are automatic with their math operations. And then when we look overall at general math skills, we also see that only about half of students, or 52%, are meeting expectations. And so in this case, I might want to go back and see, okay, so we want to do something universally for all students in order to improve math outcomes and get more math growth between now and winter. And so at the top of this particular report, there'll be some recommended interventions. But in this case, we likely would want to do something more school-wide and would want to intervene with the whole group, because we likely have, as we were talking about earlier, too many students who need intervention to be able to provide evidence-based intervention too. And so we want to look at improving our universal tier in math for this group of students. So that's looking at a group and in math. We can also look and compare specific grade levels within a building to help us determine resource allocation needs. So this is an example of a report that a principal might see, again, within FastBridge. This one happens to be for social emotional behavior. And so it's a social emotional behavior screening, the SABRS assessment. And you'll see here that we have, from fall to winter, a little bit of a decline in the percent of students who met expectations. And I can also look then, though, at specific grade levels and compare. And so in this case, I can see that if I look specifically at maybe the winter data, which is currently in this case, the current data, we'll see that we have a lot more universal needs in 3rd grade and 5th grade than we do at 2nd grade. And so I likely want to take those core resources that I might put toward improving the universal tier services toward third grade and fifth grade in this building. And so I can use my student achievement or screening data this way to identify universal tier needs. I can also, in addition to looking at achievement data, I can also look at student growth data. So in the last two examples, we were looking at data from a single point in time. Over time, though, we also know that we want all students to be growing regardless of where they started. So I might have a student who started the year, two students, one who starts the year below benchmarks and one who starts the year meeting benchmarks. I need both of those students to grow at a high rate, right, throughout the year. And so knowing if they're at risk or not is really important, but it's also really important to know that they are making great growth regardless of their risk category. And so let's look at some growth data. Here's an example of the group growth report from FastBridge. So in this case, we can answer the question, are students growing? And I can look at the top and it's going to show me in this box the percent of students that are in different growth categories. And so in this case, if I look, we have about 74% of students who've made typical or aggressive growth. That means that they're growing really well, regardless of where they started and ended in terms of risk. And so we want to focus our attention then on identifying those instructional strategies, those groups that are making really great growth, and continue to build upon that and expand those strategies to other classrooms, to other grade levels. Exploring this type of data in the winter would also allow a building leadership team to identify specific classrooms or specific skill areas that haven't made a lot of growth from fall to winter, and focus resources such as coaching or intervention resources toward improving the universal tier in those areas. And so you can use these growth data to identify needs in the winter so that you can improve trajectories from winter to spring. In addition to looking at growth for individual students or groups of students that way and looking at their raw growth that a student makes regardless of when they start, of where they start in terms of risk, you can also look at the category of risk changes over the course of a year. So this is an example of a report that's called an effectiveness report. It's in the EduClimber product. And what this is showing you is two time periods. In this case, it's fall and spring. And you'll see at the first time period on the left, you'll see the percent of students that are in each of these risk bands. And so in this case, it's advanced, low risk, some risk, and high risk. Then on the right, you see the same students at their next assessment or spring screening. And what you see in the middle are the movement that those students make. And so if I have a system that is really strong in the universal tier, I can look at this and I would expect that at least 95% of students who start the year meeting expectations, so in low risk or college pathways, end the year in low risk and college pathways. And so this report can be used for lots of reasons, but if we think about high quality universal instruction, if you asked, and I've asked lots of teachers, I've asked lots and lots of teachers around the country, what percentage of students who start the year on track do you expect to grow enough to end the year on track? And every single time I've asked a teacher that question, they've said 100%. I expect all of my students who begin the year on track to grow enough to end the year on track. And so when we think about and we have the opportunity to look at our data by benchmark to benchmark, we can look to see what percent of students who started the year on track grew enough to stay on track. And we would expect our universal tier to support that. We can also do fun things with a report like this in terms of intervention to look at the effectiveness of our interventions. But today, obviously, we're focused on the universal tier. So that's a really good place if you're thinking about continuing to build consensus in your building or your setting for improving on the universal tier, focusing on that growth of students and focusing on students who start the year successful, ending the year successful is a great place to start because teachers generally have a lot of buy-in for assuming that we should have systems that support students who start the year on track to grow enough to remain on track. It's a pretty easy place to go. So at this point in time, I am going to pause and I'd like you to do a poll. We are going to learn about the type of data you currently use in your setting to determine the effectiveness of your universal tier. So do you use achievement data, growth data, both? Or have you not asked that question yet? So you're not to the place yet in your setting where you're asking about the effectiveness of your universal tier for the students in your building today. So it looks like lots of people are currently using this, and you're using both achievement and growth data. So you're using something that looks at a point in time as well as student change over time as you're identifying resources toward the universal tier, which is great to see, and is something that is definitely more advanced as we think about universal tier improvement efforts. That also tells me that likely you're in places that that agree that the universal tier is an important part of improvement efforts and needs a significant amount of our resources toward improvement, which is also good. I've seen an increase in the past number of years, 5 or so maybe, for people being really interested in tackling the universal tier as opposed to going straight to interventions when they think about an MTSS system. So along those lines, we're going to dig into some specific strategies for improving the universal tier. So now that we have an idea of the data that we would use, we're going to explore 2 specific ways that you can improve the universal tier right now this year. First, we'll talk about identifying current barriers and addressing those barriers. And then we'll also talk about increasing the intensity of our universal tier practices. So first, let's talk about identifying and addressing barriers. As as recently as probably 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I would go and have conversations and talk with folks about improving the universal tier. And the main strategy that I would hear around the country that was even recommended for improvement of the universal tier was to adopt new curricular materials, and that I think very positively has shifted to recognizing that we all have school systems already in place. We have standards, we have curricular materials and instructional strategies that we've worked really hard to get in place. And so we have things that we can build upon. In many cases, we have really good things that we've attempted to implement that have been implemented to varying degrees of success. And so we might have a specific grade level that's implementing something evidence-based in one part of the building. And then somewhere else, we have these 2 teachers who really kept something going that was evidence-based and was an initiative a couple years ago. But we don't necessarily have the level of implementation that we really hope across everything. And so, so one of the things that you can really do is identify and address specific barriers within your system. So the first include gaps in implementation of the things that we know should work. And so those include things as simple and concept as protected instructional time. So if I'm at the elementary level and I don't have about 90 minutes of time set aside for reading and writing instruction, then that's something that we may want to look at if we're not getting the reading outcomes that we need. We need that protected instructional time as a very first level of what we need to provide all students. In many cases, if we're thinking about social emotional behavior, not having expectations and instruction toward those expectations could be something that we want to make sure that we implement and support implementation for. A lack of focus or consistency in our work. And so if we know that we have specific evidence-based strategies that we've asked teachers to use, that we've learned about in our school, having really focus and consistency and supporting those and reinforcing those and expecting those, it can be really helpful. Having appropriate curricular materials, and then collaboration and professional learning time for educators at all levels is really important. And so those are things that we can identify as specific needs and then address through supports within our universal tier. We can also look then at identifying barriers in terms of skill gaps for students. And so in this case, we could use our universal screening data to identify skills that students should have learned but have not yet mastered. So in that math example that I gave, automaticity with operations was an example of something that I think it was about 65% of students had were on track for. So we can identify those skills that students should have learned by now, and we can target those through whole group intervention. And so that means that we would provide extra instruction in terms of time, materials focus, practice for students for all students though, instead of for just some students. And then we would review data at the next screening period in order to see how we've closed those learning gaps. And that's been done with great success in many schools. We call that whole group intervention or class-wide intervention. So here's an example from an implementation gap. So I can, in this case, it's a social emotional behavior example. So I can identify common remote learning expectations. And so maybe we expect all students to, if being respectful is one of our school-wide expectations. In a classroom setting, we may have specific examples of what that looks like, and we teach those to students remotely. Maybe we are going to expect that all students use the chat and feedback in Zoom to communicate if they have questions and to indicate if they need to maybe take care of another need. So if they need to get up for a moment to go use the washroom or fill up their water, that we expect them to use the chat and feedback within Zoom to do that. And so I'm going to teach those expectations to students during the first week of remote learning, and I'm going to reinforce the use of those behaviors in each session. And so I'm going to say that I really appreciate that Lynn is showing me a thumbs up or is raising her hand when she has a question. I'm going to notice that someone said, "Be right back," when they needed to get up and get a glass of water, and they were in fact right back. And so I'm going to reinforce and let students know that I'm noticing that they're practicing those things that we talked about. And here's an example of a skill gap. And so we might have identified that reading fluency, for instance, let's say at fourth grade in the fall, we did universal screening and identified reading fluency as something that we had a lot of students who continue to need additional support for. This is an example of an intervention that's within the FastBridge system for repeated reading with a partner. This intervention can be used either whole group or in small group instruction. And so the teacher is implementing that 20 minutes per day, 4 days a week. And so you can identify specific pieces of skill gaps based on your universal screening data. The second set of strategies, so we've talked about identifying barriers and addressing those barriers, either within implementation of what you were planning to do or in specific skills that students should have attained. You can also increase the intensity of your instruction at the universal tier. So one way to improve universal tier instruction right away is potentially to decrease the group size for groups of students who are receiving that universal tier instruction. You can increase the frequency with which you're providing that instruction and potentially increase the duration of that instruction. So let's talk about each of those intensity pieces as we think about our universal tier. So in terms of decreasing group size, we've seen this happen in various ways. So one is that we'll see that potentially schools have moved and provided additional teachers, sometimes in the form of interventionists that they may have available or educational aides, in order to decrease some group sizes for either practice groups and or even small group instruction as part of the universal tier. And so that allows additional groups to happen within a grade level or classroom when they see specifically that it's a group that needs additional, obviously, support within tier one. So maybe growth data weren't as we expected, or we had a group that came in, right, with lower pre-skills than typical or within our school, the grade level that needed the most support, that we shift some of those tier one resources to that group to decrease group size. And then in terms of increasing frequency or duration, making sure that we have additional intentional opportunities to practice specific skills within our time, and or increasing the amount of time that we provide instruction. And this is really critical and has a very large impact on potential learning in a way that we don't often think about. I don't always see. We oftentimes think about how we might impact the instructional strategies or the curricular materials, which are both extremely important. And though we're not often thinking about the amount of time that we're giving. And so that idea of the protected instructional time, or what we can gain by increasing instructional time, is really powerful. So this is just a sample text from a book that I had on my shelf, which is Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And this it's essentially a curriculum for parents. And so it has lessons, right? And so if we assume that we have a curriculum in place or materials, well, we're getting through a lesson a session, right? And so we think about how many lessons we would get through a week. And so in this case, let's say that we had 10 weeks of instruction go by, and we got through 3 lessons a week in this instructional program, right? And this is whole class. This is what we would be reading after 3 weeks. So you can see what that is. Now, let's say, though, that we increased either the frequency or the duration of our time together in order to be able to get through 4 lessons a week. So if we were able to teach 4 lessons a week, here is what students would be reading after the same 10 weeks. You can see that the sentences are longer. Obviously, the words are more challenging, and students can read more if they receive more instruction, right? Now let's look and see what happens if we get through 5 lessons a week. Here you can see again that it is much longer, and the sentence structure is also a little bit more varied, and we have more going on. And so really what this shows us is the amount of instruction really matters. So when we're thinking about both core instruction, when we're thinking about the frequency and duration of our core instruction, that makes a huge difference. But this also is part of the reason that when we think about why the universal tier is really important, for us to continue to work on and to have a super effective universal tier, this is a piece of that too. Because in our intervention systems, we want to be able to get through 5 lessons a week in those intervention systems as well, so that we have strong achievement gains in those interventions too. Otherwise, what we start to see are interventions where we rarely have students who close achievement gaps in interventions, and then we start to have systems and schools where we don't really expect interventions to work anymore. And we primarily see interventions being requested because we want to try to get students special education services, because we haven't really experienced interventions that are effective, because we haven't necessarily had interventions that are robust enough, because we've had so many students who've needed them, because we haven't worked enough on our universal tier effectiveness. So at this point in time, we're going to stop. We've talked a lot about the types of ways to improve the universal tier right now. And so as you think about improving current universal or tier 1 practices, which of the following seem to make sense to attend to first in your setting? So far, people are addressing primarily skill gaps. And so thinking about some of those whole group interventions potentially that we can implement right now in order to help all students start to move, right? So not thinking about individual interventions, that has a place in our system, but as we're thinking about tier 1, we know that we'll need to do whole group interventions when we have more students who need intervention than slots or resources to provide. And addressing implementation gaps and frequency of skill instruction also looks rather important, which absolutely makes sense. And it's good to see a focus on addressing implementation of the things that we've worked really hard to get in place in our school, right? Anytime we have a new initiative or new efforts, making sure that we provide extra time to support those is really essential. So thank you for that. So I would be remiss if we didn't also consider how to support student engagement in the universal tier. Whenever we think about improvement efforts, finding ways to empower and engage students in their learning is quite essential. And so as we think about engagement, we're really thinking about those ways that students are talking, writing, actively participating in instruction with us and in their learning. And so we want to focus on those things that will actively engage students in their learning. These are a list of evidence-based practices that support student engagement. So John Hattie's work has really focused on using meta-analysis techniques to identify highly effective practices in education. You can go to visiblelearning.org to see more about these things and to read more about effect size and lots of different practices and influences in education. Here, what you'll see are some highly effective practices and strategies that are really designed to support increased student engagement. The first two that are italicized are really based on more teacher professional learning or system work. And so if we think about response to intervention, MTSS, that idea that we are using data to identify resource allocation is a lot of what today's conversation has been about. And it's highly effective in schools. And so having a system that supports teachers to collect and use universal screening data, having a system that supports resource allocation toward having potentially instructional coaches, for instance, that focus their strategies and their efforts toward grade levels or practices and outcomes that we know we need to get based on our data is essential. Micro-teaching or video review of lessons is another strategy that's really effective. And this gets at teachers' own self-reflection and using videos of their lessons to reflect on and improve their own teaching strategies. And so those are some things from a professional development and system perspective, we can really create infrastructure and support to educators to be able to implement things that support higher student engagement and evidence-based practices at Tier 1. You'll also see then under that list several different programs or practices that can be used that are really highly engaging to students, that support student engagement within their learning, that also are evidence-based. And so as we think about specific things such as repeated reading programs, which I showed an example of earlier as well, of a whole group intervention, highly effective and can be implemented within within the universal tier. When we think about student evaluation and reflection, and so thinking about students self-reflecting on their own learning. Feedback for students, and so how we're regularly helping students understand how get feedback on specific skills and getting feedback from students about their skills and what they know. Spaced practice, which we'll give an example about, explicit teaching strategies, and building relationships. And so let's talk for just a moment about relationships. This year, this feels especially pertinent to bring up, although it's always important and something to talk about. So we know how important it is to have time and the ability to connect with students. When we think about specific ways, both in a traditional school building as well as in a remote or virtual setting, that we can engage with students and build relationships with them, it's incredibly important to be extremely intentional in this work. I like some specific strategies in particular, and I'm guessing that others have ideas of strategies that you can include in the chat that people might like to hear as well, or explore as well, related to connecting with students and building relationships with them. One of my favorites is the 2x10. This involves choosing a student who you need to connect with. And so as I say that, I generally, when we're talking with teachers, I choose students based upon students who I know may not have as many close relationships with other adults in the building, or students that I just haven't connected with yet. They're not the student right now they're not, frankly, they're not my favorite student yet, right? And so I'm going to spend 2 minutes every day for 10 school days connecting with that student. And so asking them questions about their favorite things, talking to them about what they did on the weekend, just having conversations with them. And that 2 minutes for 10 days really allows us to to give us time to build relationships, and it's intentional way to build a relationship with a student. So that's the 2x10. In many settings now, as we think about how students might be in hybrid settings or fully remote settings, or getting to kind of get to know school this year in a different way, having very regular and predictable communication with their educators and teachers, people who are supporting them, is really important. Making sure that students' voices are in every room, whether it be virtual or in a school building, right away and often, is super important. That we know what they need, that we're listening to what they need, and that we are able to show them that we care about them because we want to listen to them and we care about what they have to say. And then no matter where we are, making sure that we're greeting each student by name when we see them, and really working to connect closely with them. And we have lots of opportunities as we think about these evidence-based strategies to really think about ways to implement these in a remote learning setting. And so as I think about some of these, when we think about explicit teaching strategies, using participant feedback. And so here we could ask people to, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you've learned one thing that you can try in your class related to Tier 1 this year. You can have students use their fingers when they're in a remote setting, right? So fist to 5, show me something, right? You can have whiteboards that students can write on and show. Have various structures of breakout rooms within Zoom to have students in pairs or triads, all the way up to kind of assigned groups that you've put together. We can have students self-reflect on their use of our behavioral expectations. So if we had those being respectful expectations of using the chat, and tell me when you're going to step away for a moment, if you need a break, and at the end of sessions or the end of a day, we have students, let's self-reflect on how we did with these behavioral expectations today. And we give an opportunity to really think about how we as students, as teachers, kind of have worked together as we go through the day. We can have students compare their work to a rubric, right? When we think about spaced practice in a virtual setting, we could be thinking about brief practice sessions that we schedule. We could have several different options for practice sessions, and opportunities for students to jump in and either get additional help with something, or have just some time to do some paired practice with peers, or do some work together. And maybe we have some optional or some choice sessions that students can bump into to do that. And then when we think about motivation, we can also find lots of ways to do that, both remotely, obviously, and in the classroom. Maybe for remote, maybe there's a meeting code that I'm going to send to students to come into a trivia session that we're going to play, and they get the meeting code sent to them when they complete a specific assignment, right? Or everyone participating in an introductory activity at the beginning of my session, and a closing activity at the end of the session is going to get a warrior buck, or whatever maybe reinforcement strategy we're using as part of our PBIS or school-wide work. And so thinking of ways to build in some ways to be engaging and motivating for students to follow kind of those expectations and great learning engagement pieces that we're really looking for, and empowering them to engage in their learning and to be responsible for their learning. So these are a summary of those that we've talked about. Again, you have these available to you in the deck, but thinking about and that student engagement is really important. So as we kind of are closing and getting ready to answer questions, I know I just want to kind of wrap up. This year, we know, is presenting really unique challenges and opportunities, unlike other years that most of us have experienced. Because of that, the universal tier is more essential than ever to providing equitable and effective instruction to all students, to support all students to making high growth and achieving at high levels as we go through this year. So today we've specifically explored evaluating your universal tier effectiveness for the students in your building today, improving your universal tier immediately and looking at some strategies that you could use for immediate improvement to your universal tier, and then thinking about adding engagement strategies and really focusing on engaging students and empowering them in their learning as part of tier 1 instruction.